Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Nir Haloani, the CTO of COTI, and I would like to thank you for joining us for our second live webinar on COTI TestNet and the Trustchain protocol. To better understand the COTI ecosystem and architecture, I will overview briefly some of the Trustchain components and the rules in the system. In COTI network, there are four types of nodes. The first type of node is the full node, which is the gateway to every transaction and any client interaction in the system. The full node is responsible for attaching transactions to the DAG, validating the transaction itself, propagating them to the network, and also executing the proof of trust and collecting the network fees, which is then propagated to the financial node, which I will overview later on. The second type of nodes, which are currently more highly trusted nodes, are DSP nodes, which are nodes responsible for reaching consensus on the account balance and data integrity. Another important node in the COTI network is the trust core node, which adds the layer of trust to the network. This type of nodes are dedicated nodes which are responsible for calculating participant trust score and basically defining how much consensus and how much power the network will need in order to confirm each transaction. And the last type of nodes are the history nodes, which are responsible for storing all the transaction history of the COTI ledger. This type of nodes are very important because we don't want to store all the history of transactions in all full nodes. Another two types of servers in the COTI systems are the KYC server, which is responsible for onboarding the KYC verification process, and also the zero spend server, which allows us to release idle transaction within the network. Now, it is important to note here that these type of servers are cold servers because currently we are the only one who run them and operate them, but in the future they will be operated by a decentralized government. So it will start as a centralized endpoints and will move to a decentralized government controlling these centralized entities, which will allow us to be fully decentralized. So if we put all of this architecture and component together and try to illustrate it in a flow and architecture system, looks similar to what you see right now. The interaction starts with an onboarding process followed by an initial trust score being generated and then enabling a user to generate his seed, connect to the COTI wallet, and start to transact. All transactions are monitored by the DSP nodes and trust score nodes, and each transaction is propagated in clusters and within its domain. I will later on describe it more in details. To better understand the flow of how a transaction lives in the COTI network and how is the flow moves in the COTI network, we prepared a short video which explains it.
Transactions sent from the COTI wallet need a trust score and send a request.
Sorry.
Transactions sent from the COTI wallet need a trust score and send a request to the trust score node. Once the wallet has a trust score, it adds it to the transaction, and the transaction moves on to the full node. The full node verifies the transaction and selects sources to validate.
So you can see it actually
It then performs proof
on our
of trust,
website and also
optimizing
in
the DAG
COTI
structure and
YouTube.
preventing Transactions sent from the COTI wallet need a trust score and send a request to the trust score node. Once the wallet has a trust score, it adds it to the transaction, and the transaction moves on to the full node. The full node verifies the transaction and selects sources to validate. It then performs proof of trust, optimizing the DAG structure and preventing spam. The transaction is added to the DAG network. Next, the full node sends the transaction to 2 double spend prevention nodes to prevent fraud. Once the transaction receives a green light from the 2 DSP nodes, it's sent to the entire DSP network, Trust Score network, and Zero Spend server. A majority of DSPs determine the transaction is valid, and it's sent to the entire network. The transaction is validated. After a number of validations, the transaction's trust chain reaches the threshold. Once the threshold is reached, it is known as Trustchain Consensus. A transaction that has both DSPC and TCC is considered confirmed.
Okay, so what I would like to say is, in TestNet, other than the other innovation that we had, we built basically a full ecosystem. A full ecosystem for us means something very different from what you know and what exists in other platforms. And as we see it, most blockchain platforms don't provide the infrastructure and tools requires for everyday transactional uses. Meaning, it allows you to deploy a token, for example, but other than transferring it to the person that you wish to transfer it to, users don't really have access to it. If you wish to have access to a token, then okay, you do ERC20, you deploy it, you transfer it to your friend or whoever you transact with, but it doesn't really have an access to it. In order for real fiat money to enter the system, it will require the user to buy it from an exchange, a third-party exchange. It will require the listing issuer to list this token in exchange. It will cost a lot of money. It will take a lot of effort, which in COTI, it's actually built in and not really required. I mean, if we want to be a very straightforward solution, we build our own exchange, which is the gateway for deploying tokens on our network. It won't enroll any fees which are part of the listing, meaning from day one, you can enter fiat and have pairs of fiat and crypto and start to transact for real in the real world using your new token. By that, we also provide frameworks which will define what pairs you would like to have, if you would like to have stability or collateralization on it, and many other stuff which are very, very, wizard-based, very easily customized, doesn't require any programming language or any programming at all. It's all a plug and play, and you have your own token, your own definition of the token. It's available through fiat and through credit card, and you can start to transact it for real. And this is a very, very important aspect because it turns out our system to a real full ecosystem and not just infrastructure without any application or services that you can use. Another important aspects of our protocol and infrastructure is, of course, the trust score and the trust chain protocol. In the AlphaNet, we already have the initial trust score, which was part of the platform. In the testnet, we also introduced and implemented the update of trust score. Now, the problem of trust score and why it is required is because many, many businesses define trust between users and define a high-risk entity based on things which are not related to the business, meaning based on the industry itself and not how risky this operator is within the network. So in our case, the real definition of trust defines and based on how you interact in the system. It's not based on how, what is your history of transaction in other businesses or what your history of bank transaction. It only defines on how you transact within the system, on your behavior within the system. If you are trustworthy in the system, your trust will rise. So all of this is embedded as part of our DAG-based attachment algorithm. It will define how much work a transaction requires. It will also define other aspects within the system, which I will describe later on. But it is important to say that we apply trust not only to consumer, not only to merchant, but also to node operator, meaning every entity in the system has trust associated with it, and the trust associated with it is different. Meaning for consumer, it represents the buying power of users, as well as the time it is going to take to approve their transaction. So highly trusted users within the system will have their transaction and settlement being immediate, and other will require more time because we can't trust them yet. For merchant, the trust score is actually like a ranking-based algorithm. It will show the consumer how trusted or what is the ranking of the merchant, which is something, for example, missing in PayPal. You transact with a merchant which PayPal process and transact with, but they do not provide you how trustworthy or what is the ranking of this type of processor or merchant. It will also define the fees that this merchant will be required to pay per transaction, and it will also define the rolling reserve used for dispute resolution within the system. Meaning, if you are more trusted, the rolling reserve will be minimal, and you are new to the system, we will require more rolling reserve to operate your dispute. And the last type of trust score which we apply is to the node operator. Node operator trust represent actually the reputation of this node in the network. Once you connect to the wallet, you will be able to select the node that you wish to connect to. You will see his fees, and you will also see the trust score of this node. The trust score is again a ranking mechanism and a reputation mechanism, which will allow the consumer to choose the best trustworthy node to operate with and to transact with. Another very important innovations that we have developed, and it's very unique, is a one-click payment request. Now, most blockchain platforms don't have the infrastructure tools required for embedding and integrating a PayPal-like payment button, meaning you are very custom in the real world to use PayPal, to take the button of PayPal and the code of PayPal, just embed it in the website. This is a 2 minutes integration. And by that, you have PayPal integration and PayPal processing of any payment in the system. So in our case, it's going to be the same. I mean, embedding the one-click payment request of COTI is going to be as easy as embedding PayPal-like button in your website. So you're going to have a flow which is very similar to what you know, and we are going to present it in a second. And this flow is going to be not just easy, it's going to be what you are familiar with, and it's not going to change the user experience once you try to transact in the COTI network. I'm going to show you a video of how it's going to work. As you can see, the flow is very, very similar to any payment type of processing that you will use. Very similar to PayPal. It doesn't require sophisticated communication other than providing your seed, which is different than providing a user and password, but it's as simple as that. Another important aspect which we have developed is the COTI Proof of Trust Consensus. And the problem with most blockchain is that they cannot achieve high scalability and they cannot really handle transaction in parallel. So in COTI, we have developed a new proof of trust consensus, which is defined by the trust score, as I said before, and a normalization, and also the amount of transaction, I mean, how much you're going to pay, and other factors which will define how much work the network requires for this type of transaction. This is like mining, but it's not really mining because it's very minimal. It's going to enforce more work on low trusted user, but it's going to require less work from high trusted user. So as you frequently use the system and use COTI as your payment method, you become more and more trusted, and the time it will take to reach consensus is going to be very, very minimal. That's how we can support high throughput. Okay, another aspect that we added is a node manager. Node manager is just for the purpose of adding more and more full nodes to the system, more and more DSP nodes to the system. And the way that it works is that it's an automated way for discovering neighbor nodes and avoiding the potential risk associated with accepting data from, a third party that you don't know. So COTI Node Manager is actually just the gateway. It's not going to, enforce anything that it's not auditable. It's going to be very, very transparent, and I'm going to show you how. The node operator itself runs all type of nodes, meaning all the network nodes are going to be listed in this node. It's going to be visible through an explorer that I'm going to show you. And by that, the topology of the network is going to be discovered by other nodes. If you are not a verified full node operator, if you didn't get the certification from the central processing server, you are not going to be able to execute a full node in our system. Meaning that in order for you to be able to execute and to be a node operator in the system, you will need to register first as a regular user, then upgrade your type of operations and type of wallet to a node operator wallet, and by that get a certificate which is then assigned to the full node itself and validated to the node manager. Once the node manager approved you, you can start transacting in the system. So if we look at how it's going to be auditable and transparent to the user, I'm going to show you a map of. This is the map of the node operation currently running. Currently, we are the only one who run the nodes in the system. So it's all COTI. You can see not just the type of nodes, but also their fees, their trust. And you will be able to see once you upload your full nodes to the system, it will appear on the map. If it's not going to be like that, you're going to be aware of it, and you're going to see it in real time. Another very important aspect, at least for a payment platform and any fintech product, is the problem of privacy. I mean, if you think about it, if we transact on Bitcoin, on Ethereum, and many other platforms, we are not the only one, solving this problem, but it's a very, very big problem. And when you transact in Bitcoin, in Ethereum, once I know that you are the merchant and I know your address, I know all the history of transacting users on this address, meaning I see exactly your turnovers, I see exactly who you transact with, what did they buy, how much they paid you. So basically a merchant by that is exposing all his business intelligence to everyone. And this is the case, in most blockchain. So in COTI, we actually provided a 3-layer solution for privacy, which resolved this issue and allow a one-way hash function and a one-time address, which allows you to generate many addresses for different purposes. One address which is generated for each transaction, for example, and totally anonymous transactions in the system. So if I drill down to what are the use cases here, so for the user, you can define the type of transaction based on the address you want to associate with. Let's say for my personal commodities, I'm going to use one address. For my work, I'm going to use one address and stuff like that. And it doesn't have to be connected. It's connected by the seed itself, but for the users who see it, the address is different and the transactions on this address are different. For merchant, as I said, you can define that you will want, each transacting operation is going to produce a different address, and for each transaction, you're going to have a different address which is not trackable and cannot be defined what amount of transaction you had and what type of transaction you had other than this one-time transaction. And as I said, you're going to also have a peer-to-peer privacy, which are one-time addresses which prevent all possibility of tracking previous party interaction. They are totally anonymous and can use just for user peer-to-peer transactions. Another very important aspect that we talked about in the AlphaNet, and it is now finalized in the mainnet and is also in the testnet, is the arbitration process, which is now available. Currently, we are not yet accepting third-party arbitrators or users in the network to be arbitrators because we still don't have merchants on board to the system. We do have several, but they are running in a beta phase, and we are not going to add arbitrators in the beta phase. But the problem here is very, very obvious. In most blockchain, once you transact, you can't reverse the transaction. You can't dispute on it. If we want to be a real PayPal-like solution, you need a way to dispute. Even on blockchain, you need a way to dispute and reverse transaction in case you didn't get the product and get some protection in order for user to use it as a mean of payment. So what we defined is a two-layer arbitration. The first one is very, very similar again to the mainstream, let's say, platforms. It's going to have an interaction between the user and the merchant in which they have a time frame that they need to get settled. If in that time frame they didn't get the dispute resolved, it will move to a very unique arbitration process done by a decentralized government. It's a collective decentralized government selected randomly, and I can describe it later on in more depth. But the majority will define whether the case is in favor of the merchant or the consumer, and this is how it works. And you can see the illustration of, how the majority defines it and how they stake some COTIs in order to back their vote, and by that get more from the fees of the dispute. As I said, the arbitration process is part of the infrastructure, but is built as an application layer atop the infrastructure. And this is very important for all services of COTI, meaning the infrastructure itself support whatever use case you want to use it. But if you don't need, for example, the arbitration for your own white label solution, you don't have to use it. It's an opt-in process. It goes also for the KYC process, which can be defined by the third party and not by COTI itself. So if you deploy a white label solution on our infrastructure, you can define all the application layer, either use ours or build your own with a simple API and SDK that we provide that you can use. And another important aspect that we added in testnet, and it's going to be available, of course, in the mainnet, is the fees model. I mean, you have to have an efficient way to balance incentive for the network, and in COTI, we collect network fees per transaction. So this needs to be distributed and collected in a fair way, in a fair manner, so all participants will get some cut of it, and not just the big players. So we use a very transparent and equitable fee model, which guarantee that all fees are distributed and balanced between network participants, and no one is getting ahead of the line, for example. Okay, I'm back, and I will move forward to your question right now. Okay, another question is, what use cases does COTI coin have in the ecosystem? I think that the first question is, it's not just why do we need a coin, is what is actually the use case of a coin itself in our system. So if I try to briefly summarize it at the fundamental level, it's something, as I said before, it is important to understand why cryptocurrency at all is needed in a blockchain ecosystem. And the main reason relates to the fact that in order to be a processor of payments any merchant or business will need to obtain a license, as I said, for storing value. For users which, SMB is something, for SMBs, it's something very complicated and very costly, and they don't want to have it. In addition, current solutions are very centralized. There is no audit. You require trust. While having cryptocurrencies, users have all their digital currencies on their hot or cold wallet. They are not the ones storing the value itself. I mean, if we try to separate it, if you take PayPal case, they are holding your value. If you take cryptocurrency case, and this is why you need a currency, a digital currency, then you need one which will be the only holder for the token is the user itself and not any processor. Now, why do we need COTI token? It's actually a different question, because you can say every use case can have its own token and take its own fees in this token. And why do we need a unified token? So this is just as an incentive and in a more reasonable way to incentivize the node operators in the system. We want a unified. We do want a unified token, one token which reflects how popular and how adaptive the network is. And you don't want the node operator or the one getting the token to try to assess the thousands of white label tokens that he gets for fees, and which one of them is really worth holding and which one of them it's not worth holding. You want something that it's unified, defines the network value itself and not the use cases of the network, and that's why we need it. Also, COTI native coin is also supported by KYC and AML laws, and it's registers, and it's something that you can really use as a payment and a utility token. And as I said, as opposed to PayPal virtual coin, this type of way of holding token is more secure, and again, it reflects only the network value itself and not something else.